Welcome to the Therapist Uncut podcast, where off-the-clock therapists who happen to be friends share their uncensored thoughts about real life. Join us weekly in spreading positivity and making mental health relatable through casual conversation, inspirational stories, and real talk with friends who happen to be therapists. Please welcome your co-hosts, Nikki Young, Jolene Daly, and Alyssa Nahara.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us once again for Therapist Uncut. And we have Michele Brown with us again today. We're talking about how she has utilized her grief and anger to transition to what she's doing now.
Thank you for joining us, Morgan.
Happy to be here.
Morgan, can you start by telling us a little bit about at what point in your journey did you decide something about this isn't right and something needs to change, and what did you choose to do with that?
Yeah, so that didn't come until a little bit after my mom died. So I lived in Santa Cruz for the year after my mom died. And at one point, I realized I just needed to leave because everyone knew my story. It was this thing that I didn't want to escape, but I wanted people to stop asking me about. And so I went traveling a year after my mom died. And so I kind of went around the world for a couple months. And, you know, I was having all of these experiences from when I was living in Santa Cruz, and I was coming back to my hometown and just interacting with people. But I wasn't in the place where I was like, I'm going to do something about this. I was still just really deep in the grieving process. But it came while I was traveling, where I thought, okay, I'm kind of collecting all of these stories, all these thoughts, and I want to do something about it. And I would say that the kind of light switch for me, I was on a plane from Paris to China, and I woke up mid-flight. It's a really long flight, and saw this like massive mountain. I don't even know what mountain it was. I think about that mountain all the time. But, you know, from a plane, everything is small. But from a plane, this mountain was really big. And so, and with this like low hanging moon, and you could see the stars. And I had my head to the window and was just watching all the towns below. You could see the lights and everything. And I was thinking like, oh, all of these people that I can't see, but I can see the lights from their homes and everything, they have all experienced grief, death, hardship. Like, this is just a human experience. And it was just this light bulb moment for me, because up until that time, it was kind of all about me, all about my grief, my sadness, the death of my mom, instead of looking outward and being like, oh, every single person experiences this, and every single person will experience this. And so that kind of started the thinking of like, what do I want to do with this? I was in China and I was talking to a friend, and I hadn't really seen her since my mom died, because she lives in China. And she was kind of asking what the last year had been like for me. And I remember saying, you know, I wish people would just talk about death, like that we would just have a dialogue about it. And she thought for a second. She was like, death dialogue. I was like, yeah, that's it. And so shortly after that, I created a website called Death Dialogue. And the purpose was just to start talking about death and dying. And that is kind of what propelled this journey for me. So I did Death Dialogue for a few years. And then I started transitioning from just talking about it on the internet, you know, blog posts, Instagram, things like that. And I wanted to do things that were kind of tangible and connected people. And so that's when I started Conversations I Wish I Had, which is a pop-up phone booth where people would step inside, pick up a phone, and have a conversation that they never got to have with someone who's no longer in their lives.
I'm pausing you for a second just because I personally have seen and witnessed and experienced this phone booth. But for those who haven't, describe it a little bit in a little more detail in regards to what it is, what went into it, really paint that picture.
Yeah. So to go into the conversations I wish I had, it goes back to, so I have a 1970 VW van, and I drove it around the summer. I drove it around the country one summer, and it seemed like everyone that summer was talking about people who had died and that you couldn't say things to anymore. Like maybe you had regrets or sadness around the way a relationship ended, or maybe someone was dying. And when someone's dying, you don't want to be like, hey, you really hurt my feelings that one time, and I've never forgiven you for it. So like, it just felt like everyone that I was coming in contact with was having these really big thoughts and feelings around like, how do you say things to people who are no longer here or will no longer be here. And
in a variety of capacities, not just death, but grief and loss and other capacities as well.
Yeah, so many capacities. And so that is kind of what got me started thinking, like, what do we do about this? Because there's the component of let's talk about death and dying and grief and loss and sadness, and we can talk about it in terms of like, sure, maybe you should see a therapist, or here are tools that I used, but then kind of transitioning into, how do we create closure for these conversations or these relationships that never really got closure? And so that was just on my mind. And, when I call it driving brain, where you're just driving for long periods of a time, your brain goes somewhere else. It's just not in the, what do I need to do? Who do I need to see? What do I need to call? You're just in driving brain. And I'm sure people, I don't really meditate, but I've heard that it's very similar to meditation, or, when people say like shower is where they get their thinking to, because you're not doing anything other than being in the shower. I think it's very similar to that. Like the best ideas that I think I've ever had have come from driving. And so, I was driving from Arkansas to Texas. And if you've ever driven from Arkansas to Texas, there's not a lot around. And it was really late and it was dark and there was just no one on the road. I could have been anywhere. It was just, I was kind of suspended in space and time in that moment. And so I started thinking about this thing. I was kind of wrapping up my summer of driving around the country in my van. And I was thinking about all these conversations and, what if I'm someone who wants to respond to conversations around death, how do I respond to these conversations I've been having all summer? And so that's when I kind of started thinking about this, like, how do you create closure for people, or at least offer an opportunity to start the closure process? And so I was thinking, what if, I had, people wrote letters. Well, people are already kind of doing that. And what if people had, I opened up a phone line? Well, but that's not really in person. And I wanted it to be a really physical, like tangible experience. And so I was just kind of going through my mind in the driving brain and was like, what if I just did a phone booth? Like had a physical phone booth that people walked into, picked up a phone and had these conversations. No one's on the other line. It's a very like kind of solitary experience, but it really provides a container for people to step in and feel safe to have it, right? Like if I had a phone line, maybe you wouldn't feel comfortable, like you're watching kids and you're going to work, to just be like, I'm going to stop and pick up the phone and have this conversation. But when you have a phone booth, you create this container. So I was like, okay, interesting.
You literally get to shut the world out. You close that door and it's just you in a booth alone with your thoughts and the conversation.
Yeah, that word solitary that you said allowed me to really get that physical perception of it is literally just you and whomever you're speaking to.
Mm-hmm. And so that was the idea. And then I kind of sat on it for a couple months, and then because I don't know how to build a phone booth.
I was trying to figure out the logistics of that.
Dilemma number one.
Right. Like the logistics were really a big barrier because I was like, how do I build this, let alone transport it, let alone find people to let me set it up places? I don't know how to do this. And so I kind of just sat on it for a couple months. And then I think one day I was just like, you know what? Let's just do it. Let's just try. So I found a woodworker in San Francisco who was willing to do it. He was awesome. I told him and told him I wanted it to be beautiful, spacious, and collapsible. And also
You're not asking too much.
It was so funny. I had reached out to other people and they were like, no. But he was like, okay, let's try it. Like, I'm so tired of making coffee tables. I'm going to make a phone booth.
He was a perfect fit.
Yeah, he was such a great fit. So he took it on for a couple months. It was ready. And then I was kind of like, cool, now I have a phone booth. What do I do with it? So then I just started, like, shamelessly reaching out to everyone and everything to be like, hey, I have this phone booth. I know it's kind of weird. Could I set it up in your gallery space or, museum or art walk, anywhere? And some people just didn't respond. And then some people were like, yeah, okay. So
Morgan, what was the typical response when somebody did respond to what you were requesting?
some people were really into it. I mean, it was the very beginning, so there were a lot of kinks to work out. So like the first thing I did was this gallery in LA, and they were having kind of a lot of artists show work. And so they were like, yeah, come on. But that was super clunky. It was a really clunky experience.
Phone booths are clunky, so it just kind of fit with the theme. And as friend, I can attest to the conversations of, I have a phone booth. Like, I have a phone booth in my living room.
What now?
It's so funny. Like when you see artists who are doing these things with installations, you see it like very beautiful and in a correct setting, but you don't really think of like, oh, where do they store that? Like sometimes it's just a phone booth in your living room and you're trying to figure out how to make it work. So it was clunky in the beginning because the other part of it that I really wanted to do was I wanted to record people's conversations if they were open to them being recorded and shared. And so that it wasn't just a phone booth anymore, it was a recording studio. And how do you get consent from people who are open to their conversations being recorded? Like, is that they have a little clipboard with a little paper that they have to sign on, but that's kind of clunky. Like there were just so many parts to work through. If people don't want their audio recorded, am I standing there next to the audio recorder, like pressing, record, not record, record, not record? It was clunky in the beginning, but people really responded to it. And so I just kept doing it. And some of the conversations were just super strange where they're like, I don't really get it. This isn't a good fit for us. Sometimes, people would say, oh, this is awesome. I'm going to send it to my manager and they'll get back to you. And then I would just be ghosted, but then other people would be like, cool. Yeah, this is awesome. Let's do it. And so just slowly over time, I started taking it to more and more places. And, in the beginning, it really was the way I had framed it or set the container is it was to talk to someone in your life who had died. But as I started doing the phone booth more and more, I changed the language to talk to people in your life who are no longer around, because even though I originally set the container around death, I found people were asking me like, hey, I kind of want to talk to my ex-partner. We don't talk anymore, but they're alive. Can I talk to them? And then I'm like, oh yeah, like who am I to tell you who and who you can't talk to? And so, yeah, so come on in. And so in the recent years, I really opened up that container to just be a place to have a conversation with someone that you're not really able to talk to right now. I've had people talk to, I had one person talk to their dad who is alive, but they don't have contact with for certain reasons. I've had people talk to, former partners. I've had people talk to pets. One of my more surprising pet stories was because I was listening to the audio after I did this event, and someone was on the phone, in the phone booth and saying, I've been thinking about you a lot. And, when you came to us, you were so broken and, just painting this horrible story of like a broken life. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is, my brain went to like a child who had been, and then she was like, but you were such a great family cat. And I was like, oh my God.
So glad that was not what
yeah, but I was like, my heart was breaking, and I was like, oh, I mean, my heart still breaks for abused animals, but I had just gone down, like the way they set it up was so amazing that I just started laughing because I was like,
that's not what you expected.
it's not.
But speaks so real to how traumatic and complex the loss of a pet could be too, right? Because pets are super important.
Yeah, like whether it's a pet or a partner or, it really, people just really went for it. And so, yeah, that's kind of conversations I wish I had. It before coronavirus, it was showing up in galleries, museums, people's backyards. I kind of would take it wherever people wanted it. And then, I paused for a little bit to kind of like taking a collapsible phone booth up and down the state is not easy, especially when it's in a 1970 VW that breaks. So I kind of took a break from doing that to kind of regroup. And then right when I was starting to come back to doing it again, coronavirus hit. So, and I don't think people are going to be stepping in enclosed phone booths and picking up a phone that other people have touched.
Conversations I wish I had is going to have a sanitation department and
for sure. Coronavirus protocol policies.
Yeah.
And Morgan's being pretty humble about this too, but lives in California, has been invited to bring Conversations I Wish I Had to New York, I believe was the most recent request. And yes, it's sought after art installation that's just, it just is so phenomenal, like combining creativity with such a real life emotional issue. And I don't have that creative brain. So I just love when other people can take something so deep and make such a tangible creative outlet for it.
And I'm going to make the assumption here that 6 years ago, when you were deep in that grief processing and you were in that haze, you never would have imagined or fathomed that your life would be where it is now, doing the things that you're doing with Death Dialogue and Conversations I Wish I Had. And that is just such an incredible journey that I think I could speak for all three of us. We are so honored to have you on this podcast to be able to talk about something that was so tragic and traumatic for you. But also you are now in this place where you are helping others heal. You are inspiring others. I'm feeling a lot of energy in my body right now because I'm like, yes, that is genius. Because you're right. Therapy might not be for everybody. These other things that might have worked for me maybe don't work for you. But here's another option that could work.
Totally. I think that is this kind of, thread that kind of goes through all of my work and the things that I do is I don't do anything that I don't want to see in the world, right? So that kind of goes back to the anger conversation where I was angry that there were things not in the world that I wanted to have or do. And so I was like, okay, let's just create them. And I think, it goes in to go back to the therapy conversation. I love therapy. I've been in it since my mom died. I can't imagine my life without it. But I also can't say it's for everyone, especially when you take into context, maybe access. Maybe someone doesn't have access to therapy either through their insurance or financially. It doesn't take into context race. Like maybe, it doesn't take into the context, like maybe the trauma or the experience that you might experience as a Black person. And so therapy might feel unsafe unless you have a therapist who understands the experience and trauma of what it's like to be you. And so that's why, I love therapy, but I can't say therapy's for everyone. And so all of my projects are saying, okay, so therapy, I love therapy, and it's not the only way. So what are some other ways that we can process our grief and find closure and healing in this process? So
It sounds like Morgan is doing what we're trying to do with mental health. She's trying to make death and dying more relatable and part of everyday conversation.
Exactly.
Well done. Death dialogue is like, yes, well
Love
said.
it. Exactly. We have parallel missions. We're taking mental health as a very broad topic and trying to make it relatable and insert it into everyday conversation. And you've taken that with grief and death and loss and creating a dialogue about that. And I know
And you've inserted it into a telephone booth that is collapsible, that travels everywhere. That is pure genius.
And I focus on, so far we focused on conversations I wish I'd had, but I know that you're doing more than just that as well. You've got just an overflowing creative brain.
Yeah. So, another project that I've been doing for a couple years now, it's called A Different Kind of Mother's Day. And I connect people who have lost a mom with people who've lost a child of any age, right? So whether your child is 50 or 2, to have a conversation on Mother's Day. And that was spurred from, a couple years ago, Mother's Day was coming up and I was on Facebook and I saw an ad for Mother's Day and my thought was like, oh my God, not again. Like this comes up every single year and somehow I forget that it's a yearly thing that's coming up until I see an ad or someone says like, happy, Mother's Day's coming up, get your chocolate or something. Like it's an ad because ads start so early. And then I'm like, I don't want to do this again. And so, A Different Kind of Mother's Day was born out of that, where I was like, Mother's Day sucks. There are so many people who are left out of this cookie cutter Hallmark card narrative of Mother's Day. So what do we do for them? Because they're still alive on that day, but I'm pretty sure they're not having a good time. So yeah, that's one of the projects I was doing. I'm kind of forgetting all my projects because in coronavirus.
I know. Everything screeched to a halt. I personally can attest to how you have taken your experiences. And last week you had mentioned that you have a lot of memories in black and white. I have also, which leads me to think of black and white photography. I've personally witnessed how you have taken your grief and put it into pictures, which is really hard to do. It's one thing to be a fantastic photographer. It's a whole nother thing to be able to take your experience and portray it through photography. And that's something that I just really enjoy as well, is watching you express yourself.
What was it? A year after my mom died, I wanted to do this photo project where I kind of revisited the places of early grief and did a photo project around it. And Nikki was so kind and drove me all around. But then recently, a lot of my photo projects are, like one that I was doing right before coronavirus hit was, so my mom was killed by a commercial truck driver who swerved into her lane and killed her. And so in the early days after she died, I really hated all truck drivers without knowing them and was just kind of made this blanket statement. And, that went away pretty quickly, but I still think about that where I was so easy to just hate a group of people that I didn't know based on my pain and trauma. And so right before coronavirus hit, I was doing a photo series where I met up with truck drivers and got to know them and their life as truck drivers and, take their portraits. It got stopped because of coronavirus, but that was even another way of, wanting to connect with people on this level and recognize that when we connect as people, I'm seeing you as a truck driver and I want to see you as a truck driver because that's who you are, but I can also recognize that you are a human and you have your own struggles that you're going through. And so for me to say I hate you was such a terrible thing to say. And yet we see that through every part of life, right? Especially right now in 2020, we are seeing so many people hating each other. And the kind of question I posed with this photo project is, what if we actually got to know those people that we say we hate? And so,
Yeah. And the timing of that, and I know it's frustrating that Rona has really put that stop on these projects that you had in the works. But I almost think about once you do get to a place where you can resume this project, how powerful it might be because of everything. It would have been powerful initially because of your own personal experience and people's individual experiences, but it's possible that it might be 10 times more powerful in as a whole, just because of what we've endured and witnessed and been a part of as society over the last 8 months. Longer, but it's come to light within the last 8 months.
right. And like how special when we can kind of see people again, that I can get back to the project and, special to meet with them before coronavirus. And then now it's, even more special because we couldn't do it for so long.
Morgan, we've heard you talk a lot about working with different people from different projects, the death dialogue, the phone booth, the Mother's Day. What are some responses after communicating with these people and doing these different things have you received?
I think a lot of the responses I've had are, I think people are grateful for the opportunity to participate in different ways. Sometimes, like with the phone booth, especially, sometimes people will approach it because when you see a phone booth in the distance, or if you're in a gallery and you see it, you don't really know what it's about. So people approach it and be like, "What is this?" And you'll say, "I'll tell them," and then they'll kind of like back away slowly. Bye. But even that is fine because it kind of, in my mind, I'm like, I just lodged something in their brain that made them really uncomfortable. And like, I may not see the effects of that, but what's that going to do tomorrow, the next day, the next day? And so, yeah, I think that's a pretty common response with the phone booth, especially where people are like, I can't do that. I can't do that. I mean, like even my own family hasn't done it. And like they've seen every part of the phone booth. And, even my twin, who I'm really close with, she was like, yeah, I'm never going in there.
Which speaks to the level of discomfort around the topic of death and dying. And everybody handles it differently. And you have identified that what you need to do to cope is to feel all of the emotions, and for many people the defense is to shut that down. Don't go there, can't go there, won't, not walking in that booth.
My twin, she's like, I'm happy it exists, I just don't want to go in there.
So for those who have been brave enough to step through that door and it has been the right time for them, have you gotten feedback from just the effect? And you mentioned grateful. Have people ever shared in detail, maybe not, but if people shared in detail with you in regards to how it's helped them in their process?
So a lot of people, I don't know the people who step in because they're stepping in the phone booth in these kind of public places. So I don't see the effects days, weeks later, but sometimes I do talk to them kind of in the immediate aftermath. And, I think there's one person that really stands out to me who is this girl or this person who went into the phone booth. They were younger, maybe 18 or so, and they came out just like crying. And so an interesting part of the phone booth when I'm present with it is I'm also kind of available to process things with people. And so, she was just crying, and I was just kind of there with her, and she was saying, my grandparents live in Mexico. I haven't gotten to see them for years. And it was so special to get to step in the phone booth and pick up the phone and just talk to them in Spanish. And so I think that was a really cool thing, where people are using the phone booth in a multilingual sense, that it will kind of meet you where you want to be met. And the other thing that I tell people with the phone booth is that you don't have to go into the sad or the hard or the whatever. Like, if you want to tell whoever you're talking to the kind of eggs that you had for breakfast, you can do that too. Every time I set up the phone booth, I talk to my mom. And sometimes it's like, this shitty thing is happening, I'm sad about this, whatever, whatever. And sometimes it's like, saw a really pretty sunset yesterday. Like, it doesn't have to always be sad and these processing things. Like, sometimes it's just nice to know that it's available to just talk. But yeah, so that was someone that really stands out to me. I think a lot of people kind of come out, either they have been crying or they are crying. And I don't always talk to them a lot, but usually when I'm there, they'll do like a thank you. That was nice. Like, like a gratitude response. But I never hear the effects of it later on. Like, because I don't know these people. It's kind of this like container for the moment, and then it moves on. Or like, so before coronavirus, I was starting to transition the concept of conversations I wish I had into something that was more of a collective conversations I wish I had. So instead of putting the phone booth in a room, I was a part of this thing where a bunch of different artists were coming to this art gallery and installing pieces of work. So instead of doing the phone booth, what I did was I took pieces from, I call it the call log, or the call log in the phone booth, which has questions or open statements to kind of get people started. And it's just a book that sits in the phone booth, and it says, I remember the last time when we blank, or I wish I could tell you blank, or, the first time I did X without you was. It's these very open statements for just to get people's minds turning. And so for this most recent installation that I did, that was conversations I wish I had, but without the phone booth, was I took those questions and I printed them on flyers, and then people were able to write out their conversations and then hang them up in this room all over. And that was, more of a collective experience where you were able to see what other people were writing. So like the phone booth is like a pretty solitary experience. I don't know what people are saying. Other people don't know what other people are saying. And then they step out, and then there's kind of like a thank you, or maybe a little more processing, but then that's it. Whereas the flags that we hung up in this room, you could walk through them and see what everyone was processing. And it was so cool to see what people were saying and the different languages that they were writing in. And also not knowing what people were writing because they were in different languages. And so
it's like two different ways of opening up the conversation. One, it's giving the individual person the safe space to do that and start that within themselves. And then the second description is a really good way of starting to open that up more as a group, where we can share these experiences with each other. It doesn't necessarily have to be just me handling my grief alone by myself, where oftentimes we need that safe space to begin the process, but I can also share this with the people around me, and it can just be.
Yeah, it was so cool to just see them all hanging in this room. And it's like everyone's collective conversations just kind of hanging together, and that you can walk through them and move through them and read what other people are processing. There was one that really stood out to me, where the prompt was, I wish I had asked you blank. And the person wrote, sometimes they're really long and sometimes they're really short. And this person just wrote a really short, I wish I had asked you about your time in a concentration camp. And like that alone for me opened up like this moment of like, yeah, what would that be like to have someone in your life that you've never asked about this traumatic, you know, I like maybe they didn't want to talk about it, but then maybe you also didn't ask. And then just to kind of hold that, like you can't ask them about their experience anymore and then now they're gone. But then to kind of release it and say, I wish I had asked you. And now it's hanging in this room on this flyer and other people can read it, but there's something that there's kind of a closure to it. I mean, I can't speak for them, but whenever I've participated in my own projects, there always seems to be this kind of ending closure or just leaving feeling a little bit lighter.
Well, very similar to what you mentioned in the last episode about when people come to you with a statement, you don't have to take it on. So it's just another way of lightening the load a little bit and taking some of that weight off. It's still there. It still exists, but right now it's hanging on a wall as opposed to just something I keep inside and maybe there's guilt associated with it or regret.
Morgan, one of the biggest turning points that you've mentioned from the first episode to now today's episode is when you had the epiphany that this was not only your pain, that everybody experiences this pain in some capacity at some point in life. What advice or words of encouragement do you have for our listeners who might be experiencing something similar, their own personal grief journey?
Yeah, I think the thing that comes to mind is really similar to what I said in the last episode of if you're experiencing grief or pain on your own journey, that my biggest piece of advice is to stay open to your emotions and to process it in a way that feels good for you. So if therapy doesn't feel good for you, find another avenue. There isn't one way, maybe in the immediate aftermath of my mom dying, I wrote her letters. That was incredibly healing for me. And so, I think it's really easy to say, what do I do? Like if I'm processing these things, I need therapy. That's kind of something that is just like an immediate go-to for people. But I think if it's not accessible for you, or it can be in conjunction with, right? Like I was in therapy and I was writing these letters and I was exploring through my photography. Like that, my biggest piece of advice is to not put yourself in a box of what you should do. That you can ask yourself what you need before you ask yourself what society thinks you need.
And Morgan, if our listeners wanted to reach you or reach you directly or follow your projects, how can they do that?
So they can find me at morganmichelebrown.com. That's Michelle with one L. I recently transitioned all of my work to be making art under my name instead of these other things. Or you can find me on Instagram at Morgan Michele Brown, also with one L in the Michelle.
Centralizing, because I think it started off as this one project, and then because, like I've said many times, so creative, there's so many different avenues. Let's centralize it all under one umbrella.
Yeah, because I started out as Death Dialogue, but then I was doing a different kind of Mother's Day, and then I was doing Conversations I Wish I Had, and then it started to get confusing where people who, if they didn't really know my different projects, they'd be like, oh, how's Death Dialogue going? And I'd be like, oh, what part of it? And they're like, oh, the phone booth. And I'm like, oh, but that's Conversations I Wish I Had. I had so many projects going that it was just getting a little confusing. So I was like, you know what? I make work under morganmichelebrown.com, and you can find Conversations I Wish I Had. You can find a different kind of Mother's Day. Like that's the central hub for it all now.
If anybody has any questions, you guys are welcome to visit Morgan Brown's website at morganmichelebrown.com with one L, or you're also welcome to reach us directly and we can get you connected with her. When we do have our show notes available for today's episode, we'll also include a link so it's easier for you guys to access. I just want to say thank you again, Morgan. You have spent tons of time with us on this episode, and we appreciate you so much for being here. Thank you.
It's been fun. Thanks for having me.
And I want to thank Morgan for being the voice that starts these conversations. And I also want to challenge our listeners a little bit. death and dying and loss is not something that society in general is comfortable talking about, but I am going to challenge you a little bit to try to look at your own role in that and see where you can start those conversations.
Yes, and we would love for you to join us next week on our episode. Jolene, Nikki, and I are going to be doing a discussion around our conversation with Morgan, and we're going to be going a little bit more in depth around grief and the grief process from a therapeutic and clinical perspective. So please come back next week to join our episode on that. Thank you for allowing us into your lives this morning, and we hope we see you soon on the next Therapist Uncut episode.
Bye.
Thank you for joining Therapist Uncut, a production of AMP Smart Business. To learn more about Therapist Uncut and stay up on upcoming episodes, please subscribe and follow us on social media. As a reminder, although the Therapist Uncut co-hosts are licensed therapists, they are not your therapists. This podcast is not intended to substitute professional mental health counseling. If you need professional therapy, please contact your local provider or primary care provider. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Therapist Uncut.